sunset of Canadian National Steam. In 1952, Canadian National Railways took delivery of over 100 diesel-electric locomotives, and thus began a transition that would see the end of steam by early 1960. As all classes of power continuously fell victim to the cutting torch, Newton Rossiter, one of Canada's foremost steam authorities and photographers, had the foresight to capture on film these final years of CN Steam. In a moment, Newton will relate, along with retired locomotive engineer Steve Rennick, what these final years of CN Steam were like. Joining Canadian Pacific in 1946, Newton Rossiter worked in the locomotive shops, on the engines, and finally the car department until retiring in 1986. Steve Rennick hired on with CN as a fireman in 1950 and ended his career in 1990 as a locomotive engineer with Via Rail Canada.
Thanks, Steve. The scenes we are watching show CN Steam Power in southern Ontario during its last days and hours of operation. This is the end of an era. Few people in a lifetime witnessed such a sudden change in the technology as did the railroader when adapting to the diesel age after a century of steam traction. We all recognize, of course, that progress must prevail. However, it's hard to reconcile when it occurs in your time. As I'm talking, we have seen passing before us some of the last vestiges of steam action in the Bayview area of Hamilton. We have with us a retired CN engineer, Steve Rennick, who experienced both regular steam service and the steam excursion years. Well, Steve, I guess these scenes bring back a lot of memories.
Yes, they sure do, Newton. The 6200 engines were called classics. They were powerful, good riding, comfortable, ample cab room. From engineer standpoint, they were easy to operate. And from the fireman's standpoint, these engines were equipped with HT stokers, exhaust steam injectors, and they were a fireman's delight.
I guess in your time, Steve, you had quite a bit of experience on assist engines.
Yes, we sure did, Newton. We had helper service between Strawn Avenue and Scarborough, Port Union, Scarborough, and we also had this service from Bayview to Copetown, and Meriden to Lock 25, Thorold Sub.
Oh, here comes 75, the Forest City. It was a real fast job, eh, Steve?
Yes, these engines were equipped with booster engines installed directly beneath the cab. The booster was used to assist the main drivers when leaving stations only. But there was a game played between the engineer and the fireman, and the engineer used it a lot of times unnecessarily just to kill the fireman for steam and water.
There was always one of those in the crowd to make life miserable for you.
That's very true, Newton. This scene is sort of a sad state of affairs. That was the beginning of the end for the steam engines, and the diesels were taking over.
Yeah, they had enough diesels to even take over on the assists. This is Sunday, March the 29th, and we're visiting Mimico Roundhouse, where the last stand of many of CN's famed northern types is taking place. The general locomotive foreman, Bill Kay, was very friendly to the steam fan, going out of his way to accommodate. Here we see the last gasp of 6242. She's going into the house for the last time under steam. They will blow her down, drain the boiler, and remove the main rods, preparing her for storage, prior to the trip to the reclamation yard at London, where the cutting torches will reduce this great engine to pieces of scrap.
Yes, Newton, it's too bad we had to see such wonderful power go to waste. Bill Kay was a Mimico foreman, and he was one of the best guys you ever wanted to work for. I worked there for a while, hustling engines and so on. And just, he was a prince of a man.
Yeah, he was very nice to the fans. I know we enjoyed visits to Mimico during our days of photography. Well, Steve, it looks like the power for number 463 to Fort Erie is getting ready to go to the train yard.
It looks like that second engine is firing up, so it's probably Coldwater Doyle, being the fireman on there.
Well, that name speaks for itself.
I believe H.B. Hotbox Johnson was the engineer on that particular train that day.
How come they double-headed that train, Steve?
Well, there's a little bit of history behind it, I suppose. We were having coffee at Dixie Plaza the other day, and I asked Gord Morgan about this doubleheader, and he said that the only time they doubleheaded 463 was when they were short of power at Fort Erie.
Oh, they're deadheading the engines over to Fort Erie, eh?
That's right.
Okay. We hopped in our car here and we drove out to Lorne Park to get these two engines on the fly. And here they come. Pretty scene. Two engines at high speed on freight.
Well, it looks like Hotbox Johnson is doing all the work.
We returned to Mimico on April the 5th, where a small gathering of steam photographers are trying to get shots of some of the last engines under steam. Mr. K obligingly rolled 6306 out of the house and gave a little demonstration of the majesty of steam by working 6306 against a partial brake.
That's right, Newton. The engine brakes are applied so as to enable the locomotive to work steam power and have complete control of the engine, thereby making the engine work power naturally.
In the foreground, we see the late Dick George with his trusty Graflex, giving hand signals to spot 6306 with rods down. Dick was the founder of the noted Patterson-George Steam Photo Archives and co-author of the fine book Steam at Oakville.
The 6300 engines were assigned to Sarnia, and a lot of them were the Grand Trunk engines. And they were powerful, but nothing like the 6200s.
Yeah, they came over, the original U3A class came over here during the war in 1942 when the Grand Trunk got their new U3B type engines. And these engines stayed here all the time from then on.
That's a little bit of history.
Time is rapidly running out for steam in the Toronto area. Streamline 6402 put in a brief appearance in mid-April on Hamilton commuter trains number 76 and 79.
The 6400 locomotives were the hottest thing on the road. The hot air came through the rib on top of the boiler and right into the cab, and it was a literal steam bath.
Moving to the Clarkson-Lorne Park area, we see two successive sequences of number 76 with 6219 on April the 21st and 22nd. 2 more days are left for steam on this run when 6234 does the final honors on April the 24th, winding up CN Steam operations in the east. That's a pretty sight, eh, Steve?
Yes, it sure is, Newton, and it's sad to see them go.
Yeah, just think there were only 2 days left, and that was the end of steam in Ontario. Eastern Canada, in fact.
Yeah, it's too bad that we didn't have the foresight to preserve more of them.
Right. We now move to Western Canada, where the last concentration of steam power was centered out of Winnipeg, all engines being oil-fired. Steam continued through the summer and fall, slowly winding down during the winter until April the 25th, 1960, when train number 76 from the Pas to Winnipeg, with engine 6043, ended steam operations system-wide. The first views of Western steam operations show 5 sequences of the H6 class 10-wheeler, a versatile branch and mainline engine. Engine 1389 is shown on trains 47 and 48, running between Winnipeg and Russell, Manitoba, 224 miles, 2 days a week in each direction. These 10-wheelers, they were centered in 2 or 3 areas here in Ontario, weren't they?
Yes, they were, Newton. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Bill Sproul. He's an original Lindsay man. And he said they had a few of them assigned to Lindsay, Barrie, Palmerston, and Stratford. And this power was using branch line service.
Here we see the 1357 entering Fort Rouge Yards on a short freight from Emerson. A gentleman by the name of Dirty Neck Wilson was the conductor. Many a railroader had a nickname, some not too flattering. I myself answered to the name of Slim when I was working on steam at John Street years ago.
Yes, I know what you mean, Newton. We had quite a few of them on the CN. Well-known engineer was H.B. Hotbox Johnson, and his namesake, Bill Agony Johnson. And we also had a fellow by the name of Crapper Jones. He always liked to shoot dice. And Bill Crawley, nicknamed Crawl because that's all he ever did was crawl. And also had a fireman by the name of Coldwater Doyle. He died for steam, didn't matter what terminal he worked out of.
Well, we had 2 or 3 chaps with odd names, too. One was Golden Arm Atkinson. He was noted for pulling drawbars and knuckles, and it kept them out on the road a lot longer, and they made a lot of overtime, so they nicknamed him the man with the golden arm. Then we had Silent George Simmons. He hardly spoke a word on the Buffalo Run, they tell me, all the way from Toronto to Hamilton, never said anything. And that's about all I can think of. There were others, of course. Engine 2129 is seen here at Woodman Tower, and she crosses the CPR main line on her way up to Steep Rock. She's pulling a train of empty, high-sided, drop-bottom hopper cars for stone service. Now we go back to Pacific Junction. We see the 2174 at both Pacific Junction and St. Norbert. There's 2 sequences. This was an ex-Canadian Northern engine built by Canadian Locomotive in 1912. I guess you never saw this class of engine in Ontario, did you, Steve?
No, we didn't. I believe they were all out west, but I believe that we, like the CPR, we had enough leaky roof engines here so we didn't need any more.
Here she's coming across a small trestle bridge near St. Norbert. The old firemen giving us a wave there. They always like to see the camera boys out.
I guess they were all oil burners.
Oh, yes, they're all oil burners, right. Yeah. Okay, here's the S2 class Mikado, which we see passing our camera.
Well, there's the Jordan spreader, and to operate the wings it required at least 110 pounds main reservoir pressure, or train line pressure, I should say.
Yeah, I guess they were pretty heavy to move, especially when they're pushing a load of stone or snow or something.
Yes, and didn't have to worry about the brakes because the operator dropped the wings, and that was our braking power.
Yeah, I could imagine that would be some brake, all right. These S2 Mikados, they were built with a Bell-Pair boilered firebox. And they were among the first large orders for new power placed by the fledgling CNR in 1923-24. They were numbered 3525 to 3599. The Bell-Pair firebox was the invention of a Belgian mechanical engineer of the same name. Due to its rectangular design, it had an increased steam and water capacity over the conventional radial stayed type. This modern group of engines was the largest in Canada, fitted with the Bell-Pair style firebox. Only one of this class operated in southern Ontario, the 3547, which was stationed at Stratford, London, and Fort Erie in the last years of steam. As I said, there was only one of this class operating in southern Ontario, but I guess you had experience with the other engines of the 32, 33, 3400s?
Well, the 34 and 3700s were more common around this area. And I was talking to Bill Sproul from Lindsay, and the 3700 class engines were used between Lindsay and Belleville and Midland. Very shortly after that, they used 6100s for about a month, and that didn't plan out because of the grade. So they sent the 6100s back to Toronto, and they stuck with the 3700s.
These few scenes we've been watching here of the 3500s was taken at Pacific Junction, just west of Winnipeg. This is where the Gladstone and Hart subdivisions divided. One went to Rivers, the other to Dauphin. Here we come with the one of the 3500s coming across the Assiniboine River Bridge. Makes kind of a pretty sight. Oh, bridge girders, what have we?
They didn't have any floods.
No. Here's the 5097, which is on train number 33 near St. Norbert. This Port Arthur to Winnipeg train has been rerouted from the Sprague-St. Boniface line due to bad track conditions and is running via Emerson. This engine is fitted as an international engine for operations across Minnesota. The 5620 showing up here at Woodman Tower is returning from Steep Rock, and she looks to be in fairly nice shape. Probably hasn't been long out of the shop.
That's right, Newton. It's in excellent shape. I'd like to comment on engine 5062 assigned to Adelco Way Freight, 5031 on the Whitby Way Freight. We had 5100, 52, 53, 55, and 5600s here. Engine 5303 was assigned to number 94, Toronto to Belleville via Lindsay. Engine 5575 was assigned to Toronto Midland job on number 45. My memorable trip was on engine 5600, Mimico to London and to the Boneyard.
Oh, that sounds like a sad trip, Steve. Oh, here's 6000, the granddaddy of the CN's dual service power. The 6000 stands out from the rest of the class with her deep running board trim. She's at West Tower, Portage la Prairie in this scene. And here she is again on a river's drag near Pacific Junction. You'll note the cab windows on these engines were changed. The front cab windows that are placed on the corner for better vision. That was strictly a Western Lines innovation.
Yes, well, that is interesting, Newton. We had a few 6000 series engines here, and the one that comes to mind is 6028. assigned to train number 46 and 47 on the Toronto North Bay run. I fired quite a few times for an engineer by the name of Andy Manson, and he booked the wedges to be set up every trip, and that engine rode like a Cadillac. So there's another nickname for you. His name was Wedges.
That's pretty apropos. Here's the 6030. She had her moment of glory when she headed the pilot train of the 1939 Royal Tour. Now here's the 6001, who also had a shining hour when she hauled the royal train of the then Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh from Vancouver to Kamloops Junction in 1951. Now here's 6030 again. As I mentioned, she was on the pilot train of the 1939 Royal Tour. Well, she was paired with the 6028, which Steve was mentioning. 6028 was assigned to the Royal train, and the pair of those engines hauled their train between Armstrong, Ontario and Toronto, and from Joffre, Quebec to St. John, New Brunswick and Halifax. For CN engines, they rolled up quite a bit of mileage on the Royal train of that year. The so-called bullet-nosed Bettys ran most of their lives on the central region before transferring west, some having their bullet nose removed and some trading their Vanderbilt tanks for rectangular tenders removed from scrapped 4300s.
Since the dieselization program took over on the eastern region, the CN decided to transfer some steam engines to Western Canada. These were promptly converted to oil burners. Engine 6060 was one of them. The CNR decided to use this engine on excursion trips. Virtually no one knew beans about firing an oil burner in SOD. Peter Walchuk, who hails from Melville, Saskatchewan, transferred to Toronto, was well-versed on oil burners and was asked to instruct firemen that were interested in these assignments. Instructions such as these were well worth the effort for the future. My first trip on 6060 from Toronto to Stratford as engineer was fired by Peter Walchuk. Air Canada pilot Steve Bradley was our pilot at the controls of a Cessna, and he was taking aerial pictures. One thing amused me about this engine was the fact that periodically some sand was deposited in a firebox to clean out the boiler fluids. This exercise caused a lot of black smoke. A few years later, the 6060 was brought back for more excursion services to be scheduled between Toronto, Niagara Falls, and Port Robinson. I gladly accepted this assignment arranged by Master Mechanic Bruce Kearney. On the very last trip, we had an unusual experience. An engine men from Western Canada by the name of Boxcar Cowboy from Jasper, Alberta, fired the 6060. The next day, he harnessed it, and it was on its way to Edmonton. There he refurbished 6060 for further runs. My career was complete from coal to diesel to turbo, LRC, oil burner. The latter added some nostalgia, but it was time to move on.
Oh, they were interesting memories, Steve. Oh, here comes the 6043 at Pacific Junction. This engine had the honor, of course, of pulling the last steam haul train on the system, April the 25th, 1960, number 76 from the Paw to Winnipeg, and she now resides in Assiniboia Park, Winnipeg. In a very dilapidated condition, I must say. In the Toronto area, a move was afoot to resurrect steam operation by running steam excursions on a limited scale. The Upper Canada Railway Society was the prime mover in this effort. At the end of steam operations in Toronto, two serviceable northern-type engines were still available, the 6167 and 6245. Engine 6167 was the lucky one to be chosen, making its first excursion trip on July the 10th, 1960, Toronto to Niagara Falls and return. This engine continued in excursion service until the weekend of September 26th to 27th, 1964, when it was teamed up with freshly shopped 6218 on a double-header weekend. 6218 making its first trips and 6167 retiring. The 6218 carried on until 1971, when its place was taken by a newcomer from the west, oil-burning mountain type 6060, which had undergone a heavy shopping at Point St. Charles, Montreal. This engine carried on the excursion tradition out of Toronto until 1980, when it was returned to the west. On these excursions, Steve, how did they select the engine crews? Were they senior men or just anybody off the spare board that could handle steam?
Well, originally we were called off the spare board, but as time went on, there weren't too many dedicated men that were willing to work those jobs, so we were more or less asked to protect assignments.
Oh, I see. So you more or less were on call any time that they ran an excursion, eh?
That's right.
In the firing of these, like during run pass and everything, did you have much trouble with the fire? Or, I mean, the stopping and the starting? Did it clinker up on you at all or anything?
No, I was very fortunate. I had some real good engineers that understood what firing was all about, and they were very, very helpful. They sort of, we worked together, kept the water level at a proper level there, and there was no such a thing as getting the screens wet and soggy, you know, and therefore it made the job very, very easy.
I remember one trip I made with Bob Cole one time out of Belleville to, I rode the engine from Belleville to Foxborough, and I remember we had to stop about halfway, as the fireman on there evidently had very limited experience with firing, and the fire was in a heck of a mess. So we had to stop and clean the fire and dump the cinders out onto the track and that before we could proceed. I suppose at times you did get firemen, I guess, that had very limited experience.
Well, you can't expect too much from Belleville. They're just a bunch of rubber booters.
Oh, that's what they called them, eh?
Yeah. Now we had a lot of coal brought in from Pennsylvania and Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia coal was no good. That caused a lot of clinkering.
Well, thanks for those interesting memories, Steve. It sure brings a tear to the eye. Well, the excursion engines, the 3 excursion engines were preserved, along with many others scattered across Canada in various parks, and of course the majority of them went to the boneyard and were scrapped. And the sun finally set on CN Steam.